Start recording. Okay. This session is now being recorded. Here we go. Thanks for joining. My name is Randy Hale. I'm Colorado based. I've been here almost 17 years. I'm an Ohio native. I'm a transformation and leadership coach. It's been a fun, interesting journey for me. I started off focusing on transformation and have some experience with some really cool stories on some really large transformations. But the one common thread that I found that has led me more and more over the past several years into the leadership coaching space is this desire to improve results and improve agility absolutely requires change from a leadership perspective as well. So that's been a growing focus for me over the last several years. And personally, I'm a huge music lover and a karaoke aficionado. And yeah, I'm getting to the point where I might need to start looking into what karaoke options are around, because I haven't done karaoke since probably January. And that's a pretty long streak for me. All right. A little bit about Agile Leadership Journey. It's a cooperative of amazing, super experienced guides that have a great depth and breadth of experience around transformation and leadership coaching. And it's a fantastic community that's really engaged in, sharing insights, sharing perspectives, and helping, collectively helping us all kind of raise the bar and raise our ability to create positive impact in organizations that we work with and the world. So check us out at agileleadershipjourney.com. All right, let's get started. So I'm taking the few slides, more stories approach that some of my predecessors have taken, because I'm all about the conversation usually, which is not as much conversation in the webinar format. But again, I've got some experiments up my sleeve we might think about. Also, before I get started here, to that vein, I encourage you, as I'm talking, if you have insights or minor questions, I guess, that are perhaps more conversational, I would welcome you to post that in the group chat as well. Okay, so one of the things that I want to kind of tee up here is a model called the Competing Values Framework. And the Competing Values Framework is a fantastic lens for viewing culture. So I want to do a little bit of a tee up and then talk about how does your company culture show up using this as a lens, and what behaviors typically do we see under high uncertainty and certainly under high pressure situations. So conceptually, the way the model works is we've got the quadrants on the top, which I will unveil for those not familiar in a little bit. The quadrants at the top are really focused about how can we maintain flexibility and people orientation. And the quadrants at the bottom are more centered around how do we really have systems that are focused and dialed in and execute and highly repeatable. So again, flexibility, people orientation on the top, more focus on systems and repeatability on the bottom. On the left-hand quadrants are more focused internally. So what's happening within our organization? We focus a lot on how we work. We're more focused on what's going on today. And the quadrants on the right are more focused externally and more oriented to the future. So you can see, if we look at it, quadrant by quadrant, the top left quadrant, we're focusing internally more, we're focusing on the now, we're focusing on flexibility, and we're focusing on people. By contrast, the bottom right, we're more focused on systems externally, and the future. And you can probably imagine how the other two quadrants work, so I won't bore you with those details. But again, it's a very useful lens for thinking about where do we fit and what does that mean for us as an organization. One more aspect of this model in terms of how it can help you view your organization is the cross axes, if you will. So we've got the top left long-term change orientation, and the bottom right is more fast change orientation. So we've got a speed of change dimension. Some organizations are, tend more to one end of that axis than the other. Some might be a little more balanced. And then on the other cross axis, we have the size of the change that is in focus for an organization. So top right is all about transformational change, like really, really big impact. Whereas bottom left is more slow, steady, incremental change. So those are a couple of important lenses to think about. So when we look back at that model, there's a set of questions. Is what do we value? And really, company culture is a representation of values, and the behaviors that exist and that are rewarded and promoted and supported within an organization are a reflection of those values. And so the question is, what happens when one quadrant is too strong and others are weak? Another big question to consider is, do we value diversity? And when I say diversity, I mean at the highest macro level. Do we value diversity of what people believe are important? Within an organization, you have individuals certainly that have different values from some people just like to go heads down and get stuff done and are, really value being productive and doing things quickly. And then you have other people within organizations who value talking about it and working together on it and, absolutely wanting to get to a solution, but they value the collaboration and the connection and the co-creation more than getting to the result quickly. So those are very important lenses to consider when we look at that model. Is where are we as an organization, and where do we have people who might not fit as neatly into one of the strong quadrants organizationally, and do we value their perspective? Because I certainly have seen situations where people have really become frustrated that their different perspective is not as valued, and ultimately they will tend to get frustrated and leave, which is unfortunate. The other value that kind of sits on top of all of the values within these quadrants that we're going to dig into in a minute is, as an organization, how do we value learning? And do we value the ability to try different things, to quote unquote buck the status quo? And I'm going to tell a couple of stories in a minute here about some different organizations I've worked with over the years. And if we think about these two things, valuing diversity of thought, of opinion, of approach, of style, those things are extremely important in helping to kind of round out and balance an organization so that these default behaviors that we're going to talk about don't tend to, all be so strongly aligned with the status quo that it can create paralysis. And we also want to create an environment that values learning and provides the ability for us collectively as an organization to learn. So with that sort of long-winded tee up, I really want to talk about the alignment and transparency that can come from using a lens like this to just drive the conversation. So there's 4 quadrants that I talked about in the earlier model overview. The top left quadrant in the competing values framework is called the collaborate quadrant. And that's all about connection, having the conversation, everybody feeling like they're working together, strong sense of camaraderie. Some organizations describe it as a sense of family. The top right quadrant is the create quadrant, which is all about breakthrough innovation, like trying radical new things all the time, starting lots of different initiatives in the hope that some of them are big game changers. The bottom right quadrant is the compete quadrant, and is more focused on being fast, getting things done, driving results, go, kind of a win orientation. And that's not just from an external market perspective, but even internally, strong focus on competing and really delivering and getting things done quickly. And then the bottom left quadrant is the control quadrant, which is all about consistency, stability, predictability, repeatability. Do we have well-designed, well-documented processes that we can follow? And those are kind of the 4 balances. So what we want to be able to do is think about within each one of these quadrants, when we're in high uncertainty, and this dynamic also exists, I believe, when there's high pressure, high demands, what are the behaviors that show up? And if we're out of balance, how can that potentially slow down our ability to respond to change and to be as effective as we can be? So in the picture you see here, it represents a culture, and the solid line it represents where they were from a current state perspective. The dotted line represents where they believed they would like to shift to be more effective overall. And they were way heavy in the control quadrant and really wanted to increase their ability to expand from a create and compete perspective. So how does that show up from a default behavior perspective? And this is highly representative of a number of organizations I've worked with over the years. And what I have seen in working in those types of environments that are reflected by, this shape on this culture survey, if you will, is that process rules all. You follow the process or you run great risk from a career perspective. And that is rule number 1. What I've seen in organizations like that, when there's high uncertainty, and even when there's high pressure, is it's like the gears on the machine, haven't been calibrated, haven't been oiled and lubricated, and they grind very slowly. And meanwhile, looking at what's going on in the world around them and recognizing that they really need to do something different, it's extremely difficult because it's so ingrained culturally that the behavior you see is follow the process. Now, the good news in some situations is that it's the great quote, and I need to recall who the originator of this quote is, so apologies to that person. I'm sure somebody on the call knows, so feel free to type it in. But the quote is, a lot of times change only happens when the pain of changing is less than the pain of staying the same. And I certainly find that to be true, unfortunately, in a lot of situations. So in those situations where, you know, it's pretty drastic, and the pain is outweighing the pain of doing something different is suddenly now less than the pain of following the process at all costs. You might start to see pockets of, you know, new different behaviors. One of the things that I've certainly witnessed in a number of organizations is this concept of a tiger team, if you will, where, you know, they recognize that, you know, we need to do something special and extraordinary, and we're going to create this new team, and we're going to try and get them to spearhead some new initiative or new product, or, you know, something new to help us be more creative and compete. Otherwise, you know, the entire you know, organization is just continuing to be at great risk. So what we want to do instead is we want to drive alignment and clarity, and, you know, be able to tune those dials as the conditions change. And we want to, you know, be in a position where it, you know, imagine if you had a picture like this that sort of made it visible, you know, where are we, and is that effective for us? Having a visual can be very effective. It's going to require support from leaders to really value, you know, those behaviors, value the diversity, value you know, new thinking, and help us create shifts to be more balanced. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes left. I had a couple of other stories queued up, but I see there's some question in the Q&A. I'm gonna see if apparently I can't take a look at it. And I think there's something in the chat too. So, Karen, thank you. That's a Tony Robbins quote. Thank you for that. So that's, yeah, that's kind of the overarching, you know, focus here. I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A as well as a little housekeeping. So with that, Karen, are you able to see the Q&A? Because I don't think I can unless I stop the show.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. So we have one question that says, what kinds of questions can you start asking internally to create this picture?
What kinds of questions? That in and of itself is a great question. So I think you have to have, you know, the right context with the right leaders to kind of raise the topic of culture. Culture is, you know, tends to be very ethereal. You know, everyone talks about culture. There's a lot of talk about behaviors, you know, that manifest and map to culture, but without a model like this, which is one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of it. You know, before being introduced to this model, I talked about culture all the time, and had a few different models that certainly have some usefulness and applicability. But I find that a model like this can really help frame it up. And, you know, I think a simple way could be to even pull out a model like this and just share, you know, that one of the things that you've been exposed to is here's a lens for looking at culture, and culture is really most effective when there's some sense of balance, and just ask the question, where do we think we are, and do we feel like we would be better served to shift and rebalance kind of the existing culture within our organization. I think, a simple question like that certainly can be very useful.
So there's one more question. How do we get access to this? Is there any way to use this tool? Is it available on the internet, or how do we use it?
So great question. Great segue. Thanks for the tee up. This absolutely is an instrument that we use at Agile Leadership Journey to help. Often we get called in, when an organization is approaching a change initiative of, some scale. Sometimes it's a really large change initiative. Sometimes it's smaller. Sometimes it's just, hey, we believe we can be more effective, and we want some help at figuring out what that is and what that looks like. A lot of times, the answers are not really known or preordained, and we will use this instrument. It's basically an online survey instrument. It's very simple. It takes an individual usually around 15 minutes to complete the whole thing. If they're really thinking hard about it, maybe 20 minutes. And one of the great things is, we can look at the results through, different demographics, if you will. We can take a look at, well, what do team members say? What do executives say? What do people in IT say versus, people in sales, depending on who you're including. And the thing that I like best about having an instrument like this to really just help visualize what do people think and feel across the organization is, once we have that insight and we can put the picture out there for people to look at, I always say that this model does not answer any questions for us. It helps us ask ourselves better questions that we then need to answer. And I found this to be a very powerful tool from that perspective. So yeah, you can learn more about it at Agile Leadership Journey. Again, Competing Values Framework. It was developed out of the University of Michigan, and it's been used by over 12,000 organizations at this point, and has a pretty long storied track record.
Cool. So we have another question. I think maybe you have time for one more. This is from Mike, so thanks. He says, what about having different groups within the company that fall into different quadrants out of necessity? For example, one of our groups that delivers to our customers must be in a high control and collaborate, while the other 3/4 of the company leans more to create and compete. Do you suggest the whole company should be aligned, or accept there are differences?
Yeah, great question. I do think it's appropriate that, not every, every group, every team within the org exactly maps to this. It's sort of a macro level roll up, and there will be differences for sure. What I think is more useful is to make those differences known and visible, and have conversations. And probably my favorite example is, a lot of you are probably familiar with this, especially if you've read the DevOps handbook, is this, this evolution towards DevOps over the last several to 10 years probably. And I certainly have been in the trenches with organizations and seen this, where the support and operations group is way heavy on the control side. Meanwhile, you've got product development, whose job is to create and compete and roll out new capabilities and roll out, new features and new products as quickly as possible. And what happens is when there's not alignment there and the values are really at odds, it's very frustrating on both ends. So, having the ability to have that conversation and balance, and then even kind of use different levers. If the people in ops and support were had more balanced incentive, and not 100% focused on uptime and stability, and maybe they had some dimension of how they were measured around speed of delivery, that would help shift them a little more towards compete and create. Similarly, if the product organization had more accountability, were measured on uptime and stability in their performance measures, it would create a little more balance for them as well. So, having this to, help frame up conversations like that can help drive better alignment, and still have, differences between groups like that, but certainly help make them a bit more aligned and more effective.
Awesome. That's all the questions we have for right now.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So we're about out of time. Again, where do we go from here? We want to drive awareness. It's all about, you could even just share the model very quickly and just have people engage around it, have conversations. You can start that at a small level. Hey, what do we think? And look at what are some small changes that you can make, similar to some of the examples I gave might not be so small when you start talking about performance measures, but those are definitely effective. And we hit the Q&A already, so we're going to post the recording, and you'll get that notification tomorrow morning. We've decided we're going to take July off. So as of last week, next week's session was TBD. We had one session lined up. As product owner of this webinar series, it didn't totally align with our leading through uncertainty theme. So we're going to take July off, and we're going to restart in August. We're considering some changes. We are likely to maybe decrease the frequency. Felt like weekly was a really good cadence to start, but we're probably likely to scale that back to maybe every other week, or potentially even once a month. But and also I'm considering some changes in terms of how can we maybe make this more engaging and have conversations and not have everybody just in webinar muted mode all the time. So thank you very much. We have online Agile Leadership Awareness workshops in June, certainly, that are wrapping up. That's my bad. I should have updated the slide, but in July and going forward. So again, check out Agile Leadership Journey, and have a great summer, early to mid-summer, and hopefully see you all back in August. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Randy.
Bye.